So I'm going to start off by going through APIs, how that works, what you can do with it, things like that. And then I'll give you guys a demo on how you can change some of the UI that we do as well. So we call it web parts and things like that. How you can alter web pages, move things around, that kind of stuff. But yeah, so we'll start off by doing the API. So I'm just going to do kind of like a basic API and show you the functionality. So this is EasyProcess, and you can see, so the major components are web parts, which are little widgets that you can see on the UI. Processes, which is what we're going to get into now. Projects is a way to group these things together. And then we have web pages. So web pages are pretty much where you put the web parts. It's the EasyProcess tool set. This is where it's not only the control panel, but this is also the development tool. So all of the logic that we've done for my orders all sits in this. And like I said, you primarily only have processes. Processes in EasyProcess directly convert into an API, which is what I'll show you right now. So we'll go into work with processes, and by the way, I'm working in kind of our test EasyProcess environment for EasyCommerce. So this is the site here, and we're in the dev environment right now. I'll show you guys a little bit on how CMS works as well. So we're going to design a new process, and we'll call this demo. So that creates a new process in the system, and it brings us to a blank process canvas. So the development in EasyProcess is primarily drag and drop, and everything is pretty much SQL based as well, which we'll see a little bit of that in a second. And it also it's primarily dependent on XML, so it's an entirely XML based processing. So on the process canvas here, it's kind of like Visio. So everything's drag and drop. You have a start and an end, and you can kind of build out your logic flow as you need it. So here on the left side are a list of all the services that we have available. So we have things like database services where you can inquire. We have run query, which is kind of like you can type your own query kind of thing. There's updates, inserts, deletes, all that kind of stuff. And then there's a plethora of other services that we have available as well. So like date time. Another one that you guys might be interested is in the JDE XML services. We have the call business function service, attachments and things like that. And then also the process flow elements. So there's things like binary decisions where you can, kind of change the process flow based on some test criteria. So if we open this up, you can create a test and say, it's kind of broken down into different operators, but there's essentially your basic logic check, right? You have a left clause, an operator, a data type, and then a right clause. So you can check if one or some other parameter is equal to 2 or whatever your other parameter is. And then that will kind of change the flow of this process as needed. So I'm going to start off really quick to kind of just create a very basic process, and then I'm going to convert that into an API, and we can see how that development kind of builds on itself. So just for the simple start, I'm going to go to our string and math operations and pull and evaluate. This is kind of like a way to store data in a variable in EasyProcess. So I'll open that up, and then we can define some parameters here. So we'll call this test, give it a value of 1, 2, 3, and then define another one, call it test2, and give it a value of 4, 5, 6. So that's a very simple process. That's kind of like your hello world of EasyProcess. And here at the top, we have some kind of debugging tools that you can use. So you can run the entire process or run it in step. I'm going to run it in step just to show you guys kind of how the processing works in EASYProcess. So if I start, you can see the processing happening on the left side. As I mentioned, it's all XML based. So as the process is running, there's this work data XML that is built on as the process runs. So at the start, there's nothing. And then if I run the next one, which is the evaluate, you can see we have an evaluate node that has our test with a value of 1, 2, 3, and then our test 2 with a value of 4, 5, 6. And then we can build onto this process as well. So let's say drag another evaluate. And name it output. And this one, let's say, we'll just call this output as well. And for the expression here, instead of hard coding a value, if you look here on the right side, since this output service is being ran after the evaluate service, we can use the parameters that we defined in our evaluate service inside here. So let's just simply concat test with test2. And as I mentioned, it's all drag and drop. It also uses a language called XSL, which is like an XML type language used to evaluate some things through XML. So this is like a way to access a variable and that's previously defined in XSL, in XML. So we're using the work data evaluate test node, and then right next to it we're putting work data evaluate test 2. So now we'll go back to our kind of working data, and we have test 2, that's the values that we hard-coded. And now if we run output next, now we have an output node that's called output, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is the concatenation of these two parameters. So that's very basic how a process works. Right now I'm going to convert this into an API now as well. So we'll go to our REST web services, and I'll call this demo. So that's the simple definition. Once you define kind of the API header, then you can define which verbs are associated with it. I have to check it out as well. So
and when you say verbs there, you mean the standard HTTP process verbs, right? Get and put?
Exactly, yes. Since it's like a REST-based API, it's standard HTTP verbs. So get, put, post, and delete are kind of the 4 that we support out of the box. So we'll add the get verb, and we have to tie it to a process that we just created. So if these are all the processes that we have defined in the system, and the newest one, process 529, is demo. So I'm going to tie it to that process, and then you can also specify a security level. So we have built-in security on the APIs as well. So if you set a security level greater than 0, you essentially have to call this get key API, which is like logging in, and that returns an encrypted key that you have to use in all of your subsequent API calls. If the security level is greater than 0 and you don't use that key, it just will return like a security error saying you don't have access. So we'll just use 0 for now. And that is essentially how you define an API. So we define this demo API with a get tied to the process that we just created. So defining it as an API also auto-defines some inputs to our process. Oh, it didn't do it. But anyway, so the default inputs for a REST API is this ID and then a verb. And we'll call this API and kind of, we'll see what that means here in a second. All right, so I'm going to use Advanced REST Client, which is a way to call REST APIs. It's just like a Google Chrome extension. that we use. So we'll call the demo API, and we're using the dev environment, and we'll call it with a get verb. So when we call get, pretty much nothing happened. I mean, it did run the process, but it doesn't really return any output. And that's because we have to actually, in the process itself, we have to define what the outputs are for the API. So I did name this evaluate output, but if we click on the service and go to properties, there's this REST output property. So you set that as true. So then the next time that the process runs, now we have that output node. Just as you saw it in the XML, it converts that into JSON and outputs it in the API. So now we'll take a look at some different ways to pass some inputs into the API. So the first way is the standard verb, right? So we normally set up the process to do different things based on the verb that was selected. So we're going to use some binary decisions here. So at the very start of the process, we're going to check to see if verb equals get. And if it is, then we're going to do this. If it's not, we're not going to do anything. So we'll set up our test case, and we'll say the left clause is going to be the input verb, and we're checking equals. The type is a string, and we're checking for the string get. So now we'll run this again, and we should get the same output. So we can also take a look at the log of that process running as well. So if we look here, this is the latest one that I just ran after setting up the binary decision. You can see kind of the work data XML of the process after it's finished executing. So you can see it started, it hit the binary decision to check if the input verb was equal to get, and that the result was true. So it exited through the yes node and then hit the evaluate and the output. So now if we switch this to post, and then we hit send, we get an error because we did not set the API up to use the verb post. So if we go back to our API screen, we can go to demo and then add the post verb. So now if we call it again, now it runs, but it didn't go to the output, so it just kind of ended at the very beginning of that binary decision. So if we look back here, it started, checked, the verb was not equal to get, so it just went this way and it just ended because there was nothing else left to do. So now we'll add another binary decision to check for post. And all of the elements in EasyProcess are, as I mentioned, drag and drop, but you can also copy and paste elements. So like this entire binary decision, we can copy and then paste, and then we're going to do the exact same thing, except now we're going to check for post. Okay, so now if the verb equals post, which we have to also alter our test, if the verb equals post, then it's going to do this. So I'm just going to copy paste this output. And instead of using evaluate, I'm just going to output the expression, the verb was post. And we'll just make sure that this is a REST output, and it is. There we go. So now if we call a post, we should see the verb was post, and then if we switch to get, we get the other output of the concatenated string. So that's kind of how we set up the actions for the different verbs of the API.